All right, welcome everyone. I hope you have just enjoyed coffee and bagel now and spent some time meeting other attendees. We'll be randomly selecting one participant as a winner for the $50 Starbucks gift card from those who participate in the first coffee and bagel session. The winner will be receiving an email from us in a few minutes, so please be on the lookout for that. We'll announce all three winners at the end of today on the conference platform homepage. So please continue participating in Coffee and Bagel during each break throughout the conference and enjoy the opportunity to meet other attendees. The session you have just joined is a panel titled Update on 8823 and the Average Income Test. We have a number of panelists speaking on this topic. The panel will be moderated by Kelly Encinias with ProLink Solutions. But before I hand it off to Kelly, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items. The first one is the chat feature. So we are encouraging you to use the chat feature to post any questions or comments throughout the session today in the chat, and we'll try to provide responses in real time or follow up at the end of the session or even after the session. So please note that your posts are visible to all other attendees. Also on the right side of your screen, you have access to the poll feature. I'm sorry, right here. This is a poll feature throughout the session. 3 poll questions will be displayed one by one. So when you provide your response each time, you'll be able to see the poll result in real time. So we encourage you to participate. Finally, this is where you can download a copy of the PowerPoint on the session page in the Attendee Hub. So you can download this PowerPoint anytime before, during, or after the panel. And so now, without further ado, we'll begin the panel discussion. So Kelly, you can share your screen at this point, and please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Ryan, confirm for me that you can see my screen okay?
I can see it.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining today. You can see our session agenda here. We will start out with an update on the 8823 and average income test from George Lydford of the IRS. Next, we'll follow with updates and ideas in the Virginia Housing Program brought to us by Erica Etterling. Next, we'll follow with review and guidance on AIT final ruling from Josh Brown and Christine Bennett-Martin. If we have time at the end, we can do a little bit of open discussion. I would ask each of my panelists to please feel free to introduce yourselves a little bit more at the beginning of your section if you like. And with that, let's get going. So we are talking with George Lydford first. Again, update on the 8823 and average income test. George, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you all for joining. I'm George Lydford, Senior Program Analyst with the IRS, Small Business and Self-Employed Division. I work in the exam quality and technical support area. For those of you that don't know me, at the end of the session, I'll be providing an email address for any questions you might have. They would be general questions, and also my phone number. So go ahead to the next slide, Kelly. So basically what we're going to talk about today, I've been asked to have a general discussion about the form 8823, any related changes to that form, and provide an average income test overview. So what we're going to do is talk about compliance monitoring and form 8823 reporting, expectations for the housing finance agencies, which I understand are the majority of the audience. And then we're going to talk about how we process the Form 8823, and there's been some exciting new changes, or will be upcoming changes very soon. So I'll go over those. Then we're going to go through, I've been asked to kind of give you an overview of what I am doing to update the Form 8823 guide, which many of you use as your go-to resource from the IRS. And then we're going to talk just some general things about the average income test, just a refresher, quick slide about that, and then an overview of the Treasury regulation. I'm not going to get into too much detail because some of the other panelists are going to provide you much more detail from the industry. Go ahead to the next one. So what do we, what I've been asked to talk about today is the compliance monitoring of Form 8823, reporting expectations for the housing finance agencies. It's basically the expectations that the IRS has of you as an agency when you're submitting a Form 8823. Most of the activities are compliance monitoring activities, as you know, physical inspections and tenant file reviews of sample households. We also encourage you, if you find issues, and I know we all have shortage of resources, but this may impact how impactful your review is. If you do find ongoing issues, like say there's you've done your sample and every unit that you've sampled is out of compliance, it would be beneficial for you to expand the scope of your examination or your review, inspection, the physical inspection, or the tenant file reviews to see if it's widespread non-compliance that is evident at the property. And that will only help us down the road if the IRS gets the form and we pursue a change to the credits during an examination. The impact will be more significant if we have more resources to pull from, or more issues to pull from. So that's kind of why we encourage you to expand the scope if you can. It doesn't mean you have to, because that's limited to the sample is the minimum. But if you start finding significant issues, it would be helpful for down the road to identify all the issues. So the non-compliance is reported, as you all know, on Form 8823. But prior to issuing the 8823, the taxpayer, the owner, I should tell you it's taxpayer, but the owner taxpayer has a 90-day correction period. You can extend it as a housing finance agency for up to 6 months to correct the problem. I know during COVID, there were some waivers of the correction period, and I'm just talking about normal times. So and I think pretty soon we'll be back to the normal process. Within 45 days after the end of the correction period, the agency is supposed to submit the Form 8823 to us. If the owner taxpayer has corrected the non-compliance issues you identified, of course, you can just submit one form showing the out of compliance state and the back in compliant state. One thing I will mention, we do receive a lot of 8823s that are significantly after the non-compliance is identified. So please try and do those timely, because we only have a 3-year statute in order to make any changes, and we want to make the system work properly and encourage voluntary compliance. So the sooner you identify the problem and get the issue to us, then we can make a determination as to the impact to the credit and move forward with it. The number of units or the whole building out of compliance impacts the level of compliance. So we don't just say, okay, so they've corrected 75% of the issues you identified by the end of the year, and there's still 25% outstanding. We look at that and it impacts how much credit that we can adjust for. So if the non-compliance issues, it's whatever's not corrected by the end of the year that causes a reduction in the qualified basis. So that's something that as we've worked through cases, that's been more prevalent to identify how many units and if the whole building's out of compliance, and exactly when they're back in compliance. Because it's not just a one time you're out of compliance for all these things and the owner fixes them all at once. Sometimes it takes time to fix them, and sometimes it goes past the end of the calendar year, causing the qualified basis potentially to be reduced, and thus the credit would be less. So the 8823, as you know, is sent to, a copy is sent to us and a copy is sent to the owner, listing all the non-compliance issues. Any attachments that you can provide in per unit identification, if it's an issue where you've reviewed certain units, it'd be helpful to make sure that the attachment includes, okay, these units were out of compliance on these dates, and then they were corrected on these dates. That way we know, because sometimes if we don't see the attachment till much later, or if there's no attachment, then we have to go back out to ask you for that information. So that's better to just provide that up front. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So from IRS perspective, how we process them, generally we receive the forms on paper. We did develop a couple of years ago an eFax process, and I think we're getting about several states are using it for all their 8823s. Some states are using it for some of their 8823s, but it required an IT consultation on your end to make sure that you could do the process. And basically what it is you put in it's kind of like a fax, but it comes to us as an email. And then when we receive it electronically, the clerical staff will identify that and move it to the person that inputs the forms and verifies that they're correct and that kind of thing. So it's a little bit easier system from our perspective, because we don't have to receive a mail. It's probably easier from your perspective because you don't have to print the 8823 and the attachments and mail them. You can send them by an eFax. So that was the kind of like the step one, phase one of trying to make this whole process more electronic and easier for all of you. And currently we are in the process of developing what's called a 2D barcode scanning process for the 8823. This is not just George saying this and trying to do it from the ground up. This is an enterprise-wide initiative, and the 8823 was one of the few forms that was chosen for this process. So we're currently in a 10-week sprint to, if you have a project management background or you know the terminology, we're about halfway through, about a third of the way through the 10-week sprint to develop the 2D barcode. And then we'll have an ability to scan the forms when they receive them, either by paper or by eFax right off the screen, so that the tax examiners in the campus unit will not have to manually input the forms, which will reduce the errors and catch errors up front, that kind of thing, as well as significantly reduce the amount of time it takes for our organization to have the forms on the database. So the forms, when we receive them currently, they are manually input by go back one, sorry, I wasn't quite done with that. The forms are manually input into the database. The tax examiners, before they input them, review them for accuracy and completeness. If there's an attachment, if there's supposed to be an attachment, they look to make sure there is one. And if there isn't one, or if anything's wrong on the form, they'll reach out to the state agency for correction. When there's a disposition, we check to make sure there's a new owner's name. If it's a sale, other dispositions, potentially there might not be a new owner's name, but like foreclosure or something along those lines. And then we look whenever there's an issue, we contact the state agency for identifying, to actually correct them and make sure we're kind of trying to catch those errors up front. The other thing that you want to be aware of, since the last TIGTA audit, we've developed a quality review process for the inputs of the forms. So the tax examiners have an automatic daily report that they receive. So if they're inputting an 8823 and say the out of compliance date is significantly later, or a future date or something like that, the system will identify that and alert to the tax examiner to look at the paper form, make sure that they didn't make a mistake in their data input. And if it's the errors on the state side, then we'll contact the state. The form information is used for evaluation of noncompliance and examination potential. I think I've mentioned this before. and there's initial review, and then there's a potential subsequent review if they identify the taxpayer as having examination potential for credit adjustments. So go ahead to the next slide. So I've also been asked to talk about the 8823 guide. I know I've been talking about this for a couple of years, maybe 2 to 3 years if you've been to other seminars where I've spoken. I was waiting for the last year or so for the AIT regulations to be finalized. So that kind of put us on hold a little bit. And now that that's done, we'll be moving, that's one of the issues that was done. Also, I developed some internal training that will be used to assist in updating the 8823 guide. So each chapter, as you've read it, you looked at it, you know that each chapter describes the non-compliance issue. It outlines the definition of the non-compliance issue, what constitutes in compliance, what is considered out of compliance, and then how does the taxpayer owner get back in compliance. We have references to the code, the regs, and other guidance, such as any kind of informal guidance that is that's official, but for the most part, we won't have any going forward, at least in the next round when this is finally updated. We'll try and avoid any opinions or informal interpretations. As I've reviewed this, there's some questions about some of the interpretations and examples that have been identified. And of course, the guide is about 11 or so, 12 years old. So coming up on 12 years old. So there's been a lot of changes in the law and interpretations of the law since then. And we have new counsel attorneys and so forth, so they might look at something a little differently, as well as Treasury. So what I'm going to do also is provide examples and explanatory information, and some of the chapters currently refer to a document such as the HUD handbook, and it basically reprints what's in the HUD handbook. I'm going to try and get away from that and only do references to the chapter and maybe section of the HUD handbook. That way we don't have to update our guide when HUD updates their document. And also, and then just have whatever the IRS interpretation of that issue is, or if there's something nuanced that we have internally, that's main, if you remember the guide, chapter 4 goes into a lot of income issues, and it goes into much detail. And I think we'd be better served just to refer to the HUD handbook, where the document is being pulled from, or the information is being pulled from. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So there's some new formatting in the guide. Basically, it's just going to look differently. We're going to review. The process is that I'm reviewing chapter by chapter, each example, each wording. I'm using some of the training. Council reviewed my training, so when they've reviewed the training, if it relates to a section of the 8823 guide, I'm updating the guide with that information, so council has less time and effort to review the information. I'm using any updated guidance from council based on questions that you provide to me and that we respond to you informally, if it's actual guidance. And then, of course, we're going to include the updates to the AIT, including the regulations, and update that chapter on minimum set aside. And then we hope to be able to send portions out for Housing Finance Agency comment. I've had a couple volunteers. If you feel like you want to volunteer to help with that review process, feel free to let me know, and we'll make final edits. And council will probably review the document before it goes out to the Housing Finance Agencies, and definitely after the final edits are done. And then we'll initiate publishing and post to the irs.gov website and distribute. So that's kind of what the process is. Since I'm doing it and I basically have enough to do during the week, it's been a long haul to try and get that that done. So it just takes, a few hours a week. I try and work on it, and we're trying to get it done sooner rather than later. So hopefully, I would say now that the AIT regulations are updated, and I have all the information, and we have the training information updated, it won't take as long, and I'll be able to push that out sometime in this fiscal year. Let's hope. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. I'm just going to do a quick comments about the average income test general principles. It's a third minimum set aside option, as you know. And it's 40% or more of the residential units in the project are both rent restricted and occupied by tenants whose income does not exceed the imputed income limitation. And the imputed income limitation has to average the AMGI of 60%. So, you can have tenants with a range of between 20 and 80% AMGI, as long as the average is 60% or lower of those tenants upon move-in, then that's meets the requirements. One thing I've noticed recently, and you'll probably want to keep an eye out for this, ever since the regs were issued, there's been a multiple initiations of Form 8609, where they want to change the election on line 10C. Of course, that's not permitted without, it's not permitted. That's the general rule. If it was some kind of clerical error or something along those lines, they can request council, do a private letter ruling request from council. So if, as a state agency, if you see that happening, like if you received a copy of the 8609 Part 2 and it shows the AIT box checked versus whatever you thought the project was, based on their, whatever their application and stuff, then it's just an awareness that there's been several occurrences of that I've been identified already. So that's only been a few weeks. If a unit ceases to be a low-income unit under AIT, if two disqualifying conditions are met, they are greater than 140% AMGI of the greater 60%. So you can, or the AMGI designated for that unit. So you can refer to the guidance on this. And a new occupant whose income exceeds the applicable imputed income limitation occupies any other unit. So that's the available unit portion of the guidance. So go ahead to the next slide. The final and temporary regulations and proposed regulations were published on October 12th, 2022. Final regulations address the so-called cliff by treating the minimum set aside as met as long as 40% of the units in the projects have designations that maintain an average of 60% or less of AMGI. Thus, if a unit becomes non-compliant and the removal of that unit would cause the average of the remaining units to exceed 60% of AMGI, this in and of itself does not result in a violation of the minimum set aside, as long as 40% of the units in the project maintain the average of 60% AMGI. I know that's a mouthful, but basically what it eliminates is that the whole building goes out of compliance if a couple units are out of compliance, which was in the kind of insinuated by the original regulations that were issued. So that eliminates that bigger problem. The final regulations also provide flexibility for permitting changes in unit designations in certain situations. And given this flexibility, new reporting and record keeping requirements related to compliance with the AIT have been incorporated by issuance of the temporary regs and the proposed regulations, which refer to the provisions of the temporary regs. The proposed regs have an open comment period that closes on 12/12. So if you have any comments about that, make sure you get your comments into council. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. That's basically all I have. I'm sure you guys will get into, the rest of the panel will get into some more details on those things from an industry perspective. If you have inquiries without taxpayer information, it's sbse.lihc@irs.gov. My name again is George Lydford, Senior Program Analyst LIHTC, and there's my direct phone number. if you want to give me a call. And with that, I'll conclude and thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, George. We appreciate you. Everybody, let's go ahead and do a quick poll question here. Ryan can put that poll question up for us. Are you currently allowing AIT election in your LIHTC deals? We have a yes or no question there, answer there. We'll leave that up for about 30 seconds, and then I'll count Ryan down to close out that poll for us, and he'll be able to give us the results of that poll. Okay, Ryan, I'm going to count us down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ryan, go ahead and close that poll, and we'll give Ryan just a second to post the answers for us here in the slide deck. Ryan, let me know once you've got those answers available for me. I think I can see them there. So again, our poll question, are you currently allowing AIT election in your LIHTC deals? About 91% of our respondents have said yes, they are. About 9% have said no. So thank you all for that response. Next, we move into updates and ideas in the Virginia Housing Program. We have Erica Etterling with us this morning. Welcome, Erica. We're so glad to have you. Go ahead and take it away, Erica.
So thank you, Kelly. I'm so glad to be here. I will talk a little bit about the ProLink processes that we use for 8609 generation, for the annual 8610 report, and of course, a little bit about 8823. But I have to tell you a little bit about me. I've been with Virginia Housing for 5 years. Before joining Virginia Housing, I worked at the Georgia HFA. And then before that, I was just in private market doing compliance management for developer. So I've been around the program for a long time. We've seen a lot of changes. And of course, average income has been the main thing that I've focused on probably for the last month. So very happy to see the changes. Please go to the next slide. So for our reports in ProLink, we have our allocation area, and we have started to load in a lot of the tenant compliance piece into ProLink. But for now, it's been a wonderful thing to be able to have the 8609s generated and then to be able to connect them with Part 2 when the owners do submit them back to us. The ProLink system has been able to help us to streamline our properties in identifying the information. We do a lot of data quality review in our area just to make sure that all of the information is complete. We can't complete our compliance monitoring visits without having the 8609 complete with all of the information we need for doing our site visits. We also do our 8823 tracking in ProLink, which is also very helpful in tracking the different stages, being able to insert the activity notes. We do like the enhancement of the additional page that we would be able to use that would be an attachment that we can send into the IRS. As George has mentioned, that is very helpful in providing a little bit of context for the noncompliance that's being reported. And we also use ProLink to help us generate what we call the big button for compliance monitoring visits that we need to do for the next year. As a data quality is important, so we always go through and we scrub and make sure the ones that are in the compliance period, the ones that are exiting and going into the extended use, or even now that the program is 30 years old, going into beyond reporting and those things. But we're able to generate our 8610 report from ProLink, which is really, really awesome. Can you go to the next slide? And the next one, because I think I've talked about this. So for 8823, to focus on that just a little bit, as you know, we do it for casualty loss reports, which was generally what we received during the time of the pandemic. Our offices went full remote work in March of 2020, and it was about August of 2020 that we enacted electronic desk reviews. Before that, we had not done so. And so we're very fortunate that we would be able to continue to do that for our tenant file reviews. And then, of course, the COVID extensions on compliance monitoring has also been able to help us with that. So what we saw largely was just the responses on casualty loss reports. Either they were being able to close out certain things during the time of the pandemic, or even reporting new casualty loss events. We, of course, use 8823s for the audit closeouts and reporting the noncompliance that is identified. We've seen a lot of changes in ownership, lots of adjustments in the entities that are involved with properties within the compliance period. And then I've already talked about the findings attachment that's in ProLink attached to the 8823 that has helped us to be a little bit more efficient in keeping all of the notes on audit findings in one location. Next slide. So I talked about this, the August of 2020, we had the electronic tenant file review. We did take a time in January of 2022 to reset our audits. We knew that we needed to get out and do the physical inspections. We had some relief from the IRS on when we were going to do the physical inspections, but we took that time, since there were a couple of years in between the audits and we didn't want too much time to get away from actually being able to see the sites. We worked and coordinated within our construction control area, because they do work regionally, where they were able to go out and view the properties on our behalf. And then we were able to put phases together. And so there was like a reset of the scheduling of compliance monitoring visits. And so we review our, as of January of this year, we do our tenant file reviews, some of them on site, depending on the risk, the CDC risk area. And then our physical property inspections have started up again, starting in July of this year. Next slide. So it's just a little bit of background about Virginia Housing on the audit side. So we can talk about the income test, average income test. So go to the next slide. So this gives a little bit of context, and I'm sure everybody on the call absolutely knows what happened. We got the proposed rule. We were kind of excited, and then we weren't at the same time. Virginia Housing did give written comments, along with a lot of other people that were saying probably the same thing in December. And then Virginia Housing also did participate in the public hearing in April of 2021. And so we're very grateful that the comments were, considered. The 64-page final rule certainly does give a lot of clarification and explanation about what they heard in all of the comments and the public hearing, and why the final rule landed where it did with the flexibility that was granted. And that's all we asked for. And so I'm very thankful for that. Can we go to the next slide? So this gives you an idea of where Virginia Housing was under the proposed guidance. We understood that and did let our portfolio know that we understood that there's a possibility of a conflict in the way that we saw and wanted to implement the proposed rule in our portfolio. So we said, this would certainly be an opportunity if you want average income to forfeit your qualified contract ability. We want to maintain affordability in our state. And so that was our foray into making that tremendous ask. And we've not had any pushback on that. We did want 100% low income properties. We wanted multiple building properties. And we did want to see the initial unit mix, because it was foreign to us, as we all received the rule at the same time and the program requirement. So there were a lot of our properties in our portfolio that had not completed part 2 that were immediately interested in taking advantage of average income, but we needed to take a little bit of time to let it digest. And so within about a month or so, we started having meetings with our development partners, and they made a lot of compelling arguments as to why they wanted to use it. And we started to grasp what would work best for us. And so that's where the requirement for reviewing the initial unit mix came in. We definitely wanted the units to float before the proposed guidance was issued. And so that's where we started in 2018. And then we did request a reasonable distribution of set-asides across all of the unit sizes. Now that we have a little bit more time under our belt and properties that have been finalized, we do recognize that a lot of these things that we wanted to take a hard line on, may not be as necessary as we move forward. I've tried to advocate for average income as not being much different than the other set-asides. The proposed rule proved me wrong, but I'm so very grateful that the final rule certainly is more in line with the flexibility that we have seen for a long time with 2050 and 4060, along with any additional state set-aside. So Virginia Housing does give points for 30, 40, and 50% units. And we've done that for several years now. So we know that our development partners, certainly in management agents, they do understand how to manage, set-asides across and requirements across all state program lines, federal program lines. And so average income is just going to enhance and create more benefits and provide housing to those that fill in the gap between 60 and 80%. Next slide, please. So George picked up on this, and so we are, along with the final rule, understand that the owner must designate their low-income units. And so we're expecting between 20% and 80%. That designation will happen at move-in. And so that does help with strategic leasing on the part of the owner. In that way, the owner may think that all of the 80% units need to be on the third floor in the corner. And then you have a person who's income qualified at 80% and they want to live in a terrace unit. And so in this way, this is the practical operation of a unit being able to float and taking on the unit designations. But when I say strategic leasing, it's not to say that there's not an expectation that the management agent and property owner wouldn't have a plan for, what they're leasing, but that they do have flexibility to make the change whenever they need to. So a part of the reporting would be identifying the qualified group of units, which would showing that they're meeting their 40% minimum set aside. And of course, those averaging at the 60% AMI of the unit designations. Confirming the applicable fraction. That's something that's probably just a little bit new. Not saying that we don't do that for 2050 and 4060. However, since those deals historically have had a high number of low-income units in their deals, maybe a lower number of market units in our portfolio, it wasn't that big of a deal. Like, we would report the noncompliance, it would affect the applicable fraction, and that would be reported, as we found it. But now there's definitely a requirement to accept a report of the applicable fraction on an annual basis specifically for sites that have average income. We want a list of the units that have been changed. We don't want to see that in real time, but we do want to make sure that our online tenant monitoring system can let us know. And that way we can kind of track that. I do want to remind you, this is new to everybody. So this is just kind of what we're thinking about right now, that we feel that would be helpful to give us a full view of the management of average income going forward. And then the list of excluded units. So when I mention excluded units here, that would be any residential low-income units that have been designated that would not be included in the qualified group of units. In our internal conversations, you can choose just the minimum of 40%. You need 100% of all that would feed into the applicable fraction. So we understand that there are two tests there, but there would be a question of why would you exclude units from your qualified group of units when you can use all of them? So that's just a consideration that we're having and some things that we're still thinking about in our guidance. Please move forward. So I've talked about the flexibility that we do love in the final rule. We had initially started in 2018 and into 2019 of asking for the unit details. You know, how do you propose to lease out these units? And we feel we don't need to have that anymore under the final rule, that that average income deals can operate the way that we have with 2050 and 4060. You know, when they transition from allocation to compliance and asset management, and when we start our compliance monitoring, then that's when we can start to engage with the sites. We do issue tax exempt bonds, and so we are on the front end of looking at those tenant files as they are leasing up. But outside of that, we generally just wait for the project, the property to transition from our allocation area and finish their lease up for us to start our compliance monitoring in the required timeline. Next slide, please. So what we want in our system tracking and what we already have is, you know, definitely being able to review the minimum set aside according to 8609. The 8609 form and our extended use agreement, some may know it as the land use restriction agreement, which is also known as ALURA. We call ours the EUA. We rely heavily in part 2 of 8609 and our EUA document for our compliance monitoring. One thing that we are concerned about in our portfolio, as George has mentioned, to just be aware of those who may have had one thing in their allocation application. They may have come in to request a change to come to average income, to use average income. Their investor partners may have said, we don't want to use average income anymore. So then maybe that was another change. And then you want to make sure that whatever is going on and actually being operated at the site matches with 8609 and matches with your recorded agreement. Because, you know, without those things, you know, there would be chaos and disarray. So we are certainly watching for those transitions and those changes in our portfolio, because we did have several of our deals to come back and say that they no longer wanted average income. They're still fairly new, so I'm not aware how many of those did complete part 2 of 8609, but I am aware of one request where they did actually complete part 2 of 8609 and asked for options of not using it. So that's just an aside. So the system should help us with unit transfers, which would help with, I mean, just in general with program rules, applicable fraction for each building, changes in unit designation, of course, the state restrictions that would be required. And I mentioned this for our portfolio because we do have point categories for 30, 40, and 50%. And so whatever numbers or percentage that they would be required to maintain throughout the extended use period, that would be included in the extended use agreement. But of course, because they are low income units, they are also counted for the qualified group of units for the minimum set aside, and they're also included for the applicable fraction. So it's not separated. It's just a state requirement to maintain a certain level of affordability for specific income limitations. And then, of course, we know that the next available unit rule is just a little bit different for average income based on what the income limitation is for the household. So in the final rule, there was an example. If someone moved in and they were income qualified at 40% and they happen to go over the 70% income limit that is published, well, that may or may not meet that probably won't meet the 140% of 60% that should be applied, which would call the next available unit rule into effect for that specific property. In our portfolio, because we have strongly recommended 100% low income properties, that doesn't mean that the project owner does not have to maintain their due diligence in ensuring eligibility for initial tenant in the initial tenant files. But maybe there's just a little less risk because you get some benefits if you have 100% low income properties, especially if they also have selected yes on line B of the 8609. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is my last slide. So this is what I call my rainbow and unicorns. So for tracking and reporting, there's a lot we don't know, but I would want to know about unit designations and tracking the dates when they actually happened. That goes into just the changes probably. So before occupancy and when you have an executed tick and when you're updating that into the property management software. And also, of course, our online tenant monitoring system, we would need to know about that for compliance monitoring so it meets up with the requirements under the program for average income. And so identifying the qualifying group of units in some kind of way in their rent roll in the system, the average of the unit designations, making sure that when our external partners use the system, they know exactly what their average is. And of course, comparison to the actual income versus whatever the unit designation. That could help if they've identified some noncompliance, and instead of having a resident to move out, maybe they can redesignate the unit. It's possible. And then I've mentioned about the excluded units, and that we want to know why they would be excluded from the average income test. So that ends my session and updates that I have from Virginia Housing. If you are interested in my contact information, we certainly can get that to you after the conference.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erica. Sorry about that faux pas with the slide there. Thank you so much for your input there. Let's do another poll question, everybody. So Ryan, get ready to post this next second poll question. So are you ready to now allow AIT election in your LIHTC deals with the final and temporary regulations that we've just received? So Ryan, go ahead and post that poll question. Again, that one's a yes or no answer, so pretty easy there. We'll leave it open here for a few seconds, and then I will give Ryan a countdown when he'll be able to take that down. Maybe answer yes too if you're feeling like you're already allowing AIT, and maybe you're feeling like you might expand that program and push that a little bit more. You could answer yes for that as well. So Ryan, I think we're okay to go ahead. I'll give you a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ryan, go ahead and close the poll, and Ryan's got the results there for us. So of our participants, 83% of you are saying yes. You'll allow AIT election and or possibly expand with the new ruling. 17% of you are responding no. Still remains a bit complex, so that's understandable. We'll have to see what remains going forward in terms of, how we figure out how to handle and report this program. Thanks everybody for your participation in that poll question. Let's go ahead and move now into review and guidance of the AIT final ruling. Here we're going to start with Josh Brown from E&A team. Josh, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Kelly. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me. And for those of you that don't know me, at E&A team, some of what we do in the compliance area is around assisting clients with compliance monitoring, file reviews, and educational training. And AIT is obviously the hot button issue and the thing on everybody's mind. Getting a lot of questions about initial lease ups for AIT. And I think Christine's going to talk about that a little bit more too, with some of the work she's doing with her clients. For today, we kind of wanted to do a little compare and contrast, for those that may not be familiar with how we got here. It's kind of been touched on a little bit when AIT came to fruition, and then the proposed rule hit. And then us as an industry, we kind of had some questions about the viability of it or the risk associated with it. So I wanted to take a minute today and just kind of talk about what was and what is. And at a high level, we're not going to go deep into the weeds with the time we have available today. But so the first thing is, it's been mentioned, the actual AIT was signed into law back in March of 2018. That's when it was first actually codified. But then the proposed regulations we've been talking about came about in October 30th, 2020. So there was some time in between there where it was actually in existence, but we didn't have any real regulations around it yet. And then, as we know now, the final rule got published in 2022 after a lot of involvement from the industry, as Erica referred to try to get this final rule to address some of the issues we're going to talk about right now. So since it was passed into law back in 2018, as of early this year, there was approximately 2,000 buildings in projects that have elected to use the AIT set aside. But after those proposed regulations got published, there was a little bit of a cooling off of the desire to use that. And some states hesitated. They modified their rules. They put some controls in place because of the risks that were perceived with that rule. And as I said, industry feedback did get the Treasury, a lot of public input to try to get that final rule to achieve the IRS's objectives, Treasury's objectives, but also the objectives of us as the industry to use this tool to meet the needs of our developers and tenants. So really, in that proposed rule, it kind of boiled down to three kind of primary areas of concern. And I'm kind of just summarizing here, not going into depth, but there's a lot of areas for discussion in that proposed rule. But one of them was kind of when the AIT test, or when it was actually violated, and what that would mean. So it was considered that even one unit being out of compliance could actually cause you to miss the minimum, the set aside, because the whole building had to qualify. And we know from our experience with all the others that minimum set aside violations result in disallowance of all credits, as well as a recapture of any past credits. So this was perceived as a very big risk. In AIT projects, a single unit had a larger potential to have this severity of impact than it did with the other type of set asides. So because of this, it was just concern. There was a lot of concern about that risk as compared to other set asides. So in doing that and recognizing that risk in the proposed rule, Treasury had provided some unique and specific options to try to fix those non-compliance issues when they happened, to try to mitigate that risk. But even in those options, there was considered that they actually fell short, right? Because they recognized the risk, they gave us the option to fix it, but there was a lot of concern about they would actually suffice. And one particularly concerning issue was around the timeline, where they had a 60-day time constraint, where you had to have the issue corrected within 60 days at the end of the year in which it occurred. And it was kind of universally felt that was going to be extremely difficult to keep track of and to meet, and then it raised some risk. So even the options to fix the problems when they arose was a problem. And the one that was probably most often talked about was the designations of units. So as we all know, you had to designate the units between 20% and 80% in 10% increments, but it was required to be done by the end of the first year of the compliance period, and then they were fixed for the entire extended use period. And this created massive challenges, and is actually different than any other program, because it created challenges in managing layered properties that had other affordable housing programs in them, especially, the other statutes like VAWA and the Fair Housing Act, Section 504 and others. And it was just kind of universally understood that this was going to be an impediment to meeting other obligations of conflicting regulations. So the question now is, did the final rule actually address those concerns? And I agree, George mentioned it, and I think Erica mentioned it too, that I also agree that I think this final rule does largely address those concerns that were in the proposed rule, and it really should make developers and housing finance agencies much more comfortable in selecting the AIT set aside. Now, in saying that, as Kelly mentioned, it's not without its unique complexity. And there's still going to be some issues. There's going to be a learning curve associated with it, but it's something that is much more viable now and probably manageable, but it's still complex and a little bit different. So it obviously lessened the potential for violating the set aside, because the final rule came to the conclusion that the AIT is a true minimum set aside test and it should behave like the others. So the revised rule now limits the impact of one unit's noncompliance to satisfy the test, because now the AIT set aside is met when at least 40% of the project's units are eligible LIHTC units and they've been designated to collectively average no more than 60% of the area median income. So basically, just like the others, now it's the 40% threshold, as George mentioned. It kind of avoided the cliff issue. It also removed the need at all for the mitigation measures that they had in the initial proposed rule, trying to address the outsized risk of the potential violation for the set aside. So in the new rule, they were able to do away with those unique mitigation measures. So they weren't even necessary anymore. And then finally, you can now change, redesignate the units. It removed the IRS and HFAs. You have the authority to define when changes are permitted. The designation changes are permitted as required by the other laws like the ADA, FHA. The designations can follow a household if they transfer. They can be changed to address issues with the average. The newly designated or redesignated units that are vacant or occupied by a tenant that meets the new lower income requirement, so that you can now manage your property a little bit better. So we're going to talk a little bit about, it was touched on the applicable fraction and how AIT kind of messes with that a little bit, and then the available unit rule we're going to talk about too, and then I'll wrap up and just kind of leave it at that. So with the applicable fraction, the final rule did require a clarification for AIT properties on the definition of a low income unit. So in addition to the existing requirements that already existed prior to this rule to be a low income unit, now the unit must also be a part of a group of units where the average of the income limits of that group doesn't exceed 60%. So in meeting the applicable fraction, what this ultimately means is that, let's say you've got your group of units and together they meet 60%, but you have one unit, like a 50% unit in that group that's non-compliant. It's no longer eligible. So in order to meet the 60% average, you may have to go and take out another unit, a higher percentage unit, 70% unit, and not count it, even though it's still technically eligible in order to get your average correct. And that's something that's a little bit unique to the AIT properties, where there is a scenario where you may have to voluntarily remove one from the calculation in order to meet the percentage, and therefore your fraction will be adjusted accordingly. And then the other area, the available unit rule, the definition of over income does differ a little bit in AIT. The one that we're used to is the first definition is 140% of the 60% limit for any of those units that are designated in the brackets between 20 and 60%. Where it's different is if you get to the 70 or 80% limit, then it's 140% of that respective limit. And then this does add some additional complexity for AIT properties if you get more than one unit over income. Ultimately, the goal here is we have to achieve and maintain our average. So when you correct the issue with the average when you're designating your vacant market units, if you're not 100% property, obviously, and you're doing this issue to try to correct your average, when you go to choose to designate the units, that's when you have to kind of figure out, well, what percentage do I need to designate for this previous market rate unit, because now this unit's over income, in order to make sure that I get my average right. So if you have more than one unit that's over income, that's where it could get a little bit more complex. Now, the key thing here is, though, that when you're designating the units, when you have over income units, that's when you are recertifying or re-getting your average across the units, but you don't have to rent them in that order that you designated them. It's been made clear that you can rent the units that have been designated in any order. You just have to designate them or when you designate them, even prior to rental is when you need to make sure that you have that right. So again, that's just a high level discussion. I didn't want to go too deep into this stuff, but I wanted to just kind of touch on that history for anybody who may not know how we got here, what the concerns were, or why some states weren't interested in allowing for that. So with that, that's my my last slide, Kelly. So I can actually hand it back over to you, and we can go to Christine.
Awesome, Josh. Thank you. Before we go to Christine, I am going to do one more quick poll question. Ryan, get ready to put this one up. This is poll question number 3. What kind of reporting will your agency require for unit designations? Select all that apply. So you've got initial designations, redesignations, approvals of redesignations, and annual report of unit designations separate from your tenant data. So go ahead and select all of those that you know or anticipate that your program might be requiring, fully recognizing that you may not have all the details ironed out yet, but we just want to get a feeling of kind of where you're heading. What are you thinking about here? So I'll give it just a few more seconds here before I give Ryan a countdown. Okay, Ryan, countdown coming at you. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ryan, go ahead and close the poll and share some answers with us there. So it looks like 33% of our attendees are going to require initial designations. 26% are thinking about requiring redesignations. 11% are considering requiring approvals of redesignations, and 30% are considering requiring annual report of unit designations separate from their tenant data. So interesting information there. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Christine Bennett-Martin to share some real life examples with us. Go ahead, Christine, take it away.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks everyone else that's on the panel. I am so honored to be able to be part of this. So in talking about AIT, well, just to give you some background about myself, I have spent the last 3 decades in affordable housing. Started out with a private, not-for-profit developer and owner of properties. Worked at a state agency for almost 12 years before the last 4 years going out on my own and creating my own consulting business, where I work with a variety of folks in all aspects of compliance. And I happen to be working on an AIT lease up right now with a couple of others that are in the pipeline. So it's, I think other people have mentioned it. I know that Erica mentioned it, kind of the big squeal of delight that we did back in 2018 when this came to fruition. And then the oh my of the stuff that came out in 2020, and then the anticipation, and now I will say this honestly, the gladness that I have, and I know others have, for the changes that the IRS has made with this final rule. I think it's there's a lot of good stuff in there. I think it's going to preserve a lot of housing. It's going to help us continue to do what we need to do. So a couple of things I just wanted to hit on. And I will apologize if I feel a bit scattered. It's just there's so much involved with this. And like Josh was saying, we could really get into the weeds, and I am great at getting into the weeds, but just want to kind of talk about some of the things that are realities. Right now I'm working with a project that already has public housing dollars. They're doing a RAD conversion, which is very prominent across the country, with a lot of folks changing over to RAD, which created a whole set of folks who were at the time they first moved into properties were well income qualified, is the way that I would describe them. But as time has happened, their incomes have escalated to the point where they are above where we are traditionally used to looking at folks as far as being qualified for the tax credit program. So it's great for this, because on the RAD side, they don't have to move. They have, they have protections. This allows us to hopefully then qualify these folks for tax credits. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. They maintain their housing, the owners can keep them in place, and then qualify them for credits, which is a good thing. As we move through some of this stuff, and this kind of tags back to discussions that we've all had about, as the states formulate their policies and how will this look, the IRS did talk about the fact that there are times where those units can get redesignated. One thing I have not heard in I guess out loud, if you will, would be changes to household composition. There will be times that we hopefully need to be flexible, and hopefully the states will honor that need for flexibility if circumstances change. It could be a situation I'm dealing with right now. I have a 2-person household where the primary breadwinner, if you will, has just recently passed away. The person that's remaining in the unit has absolutely no income at all right now. So if we were not able to redesignate that unit, that could cause them to, because of having to pay higher rents, because of where things are, it could cause us to lose a really good tenant. And that's definitely not something that we really want to do. We want to be able to preserve housing and preserve our existing tenants, and be able to have it be the less stressful or least stressful possible with allowing them to maintain. So I hope that we do get that kind of language in the changing of designations, because life does happen and lots of circumstances can change in just a blink of an eye. One of the other things I wanted to hit on is kind of, several folks have talked about this, is how do we keep all of this together? So now that we have these groupings that we have to take care of, we have these designations that we have to manage. One of the things that's really going to help us in the background is our computer software. So if we're using a compliance software, are there abilities to use that to the best of everybody's ability as far as creating reports to help us manage these groups, to find out where we have opportunities, if we do need to remap a unit, where that unit is going to go, so that we know that we're doing the best that we can with what we have to work with. I know with this project that I'm working on in particular, I'm back to old school Excel spreadsheets, and I have all my little buckets, if you will, to try to help manage where folks are and what we need to do. I'm really looking forward to the NCSHA Housing Finance session in January. I am hoping there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of that. I'm hoping as state agencies work on their policies and procedures that that they have the needed grace that they need in order to make those policies as sound as possible, to make them as livable as possible, and be within the constraints of the rules and regulations that we have to follow. One of the other things that actually comes up then too, as far as managing this whole thing, is bringing back the importance of market studies and managing the market. Was having some conversations with colleagues this past week in preparation for this session, to say, what are some of your qualms right now? You know, we've got some good guidance now from the IRS, but are there things, are you just, jumping in with both feet? Are you saying, yes, we want to do this, we still need to be aware of things? But some of the things talked about is we have to do the best that we can to predict into the future. So right now in 2022, if I'm looking forward 15 years, what does that look like? Now, while none of us have crystal balls, none of us have perfect knowledge of the future, we still have to use those tools available to us to try to figure out what is the best mix for us. One of my colleagues and I talked about the fact of, what would discourage anyone from checking yes on an application to say we want to do an average income property, to be able to have that flexibility of perchance going up to 80% for some of the units, whether it's preserving housing or it's actually encouraging new housing. Part of that discussion came in to play with where income limits are, how income limits are calculated, and then also the other thing that we bear a burden to, if you will, is that jobs are increasing as far as salaries, which is a good thing, but it can also create a bad thing. Living in the state of Ohio, I can remember when, okay, I'm really showing my age here, but I remember when minimum wage was $3.35 an hour. That's nowhere near where it is now. I look at, as I'm driving around town, and I see these minimum, what we consider minimum wage jobs, but fast food locations offering $17, $18 an hour. And where does that play out with the income limits? About a few years ago, and actually before I left the state agency, I did a little bit of number searching with where the minimum wage was. And if I had a two-person household working full-time minimum wage jobs, they would not qualify in 82 of the 88 counties that make up the state of Ohio. That was staggering to me because that seems to go completely against what we're trying to do. I have no doubt that at some point, everything will work out. We will get to a good spot to where we are able to do what we need to do and preserve housing and offer housing to those that need it the most. I'm trying to just look through some other notes as I was hearing people talk today. Oh, one thing that I wanted to bring up, there are some states that are still requiring annual recerts, even though the HERA Act allowed those 100% properties to only have to income qualify them at first time. Those states that are doing that, what does this look like in the world of AIT as far as, is it going to demand redesignation of units? How is that going to play out? How can a state agency best work with owners to make sure that they are still in compliance with their regulatory documents? So those are some of the things that I have. A lot of it is just kind of, it's creating a lot of thought for us, thinking how will we work through this now that we do have these new regulations, as we try to do our best to keep doing what we need to do, plus looking into the future. So, and with that, I will turn it back over to Kelly.
Christine, thank you so much. That concludes our session for today. We're right at time here, so we don't have much for open discussion, but I do encourage you to please post questions in the chat and or send them via direct email, and we will get your questions answered. Again, thank you so much to all of my panelists today. We appreciate your time and we love the content. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ryan.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Well, thank you, Kelly, and thank you all the panelists. I hope you found great value in this panel discussion today. As a reminder, copy of the panelist PowerPoint is available here, so you can come back and watch the recording of the session anytime, even after the conference is over. You're able to log back onto the CBAM platform for next 90 days to watch any of the session recordings. And the survey is available on the right side of your screen. Please provide any feedback you might have on this session. You can type in any outstanding questions that are not answered during this session. And thanks for joining us again. The next session on this track is titled Managing Tax Form 8610, and it starts at 1:45 p.m. Eastern in about 15 minutes. So while you're waiting, next 15 minutes, as you take a break, please join Coffee and Bagel. This is a feature we are highlighting at this year's conference to encourage interactions amongst attendees. So when you click on the discussion, when you go to community menu item at the top of the conference platform. There's a drop down for discussion button. When you click it, it'll take you to the coffee and bagel page. You'll be able to find rooms set up where you can join. Each room can accommodate up to 6 people. So you're able to create your own room as well and wait for other people to join. And meet and greet each other while taking a break until the next session, which is again Managing Tax Form 8610, begins at 1:45 p.m. Eastern. And coffee and bagel takes place every break throughout the conference, and each break will be picking one winner and provide a $50 gift card for you. So enjoy the break, and I will see you all at the next session. Thank you.